welcome to this very important and timely panel discussion on Bolivia's fight to restore democracy and Canada's role. My name is Ornella Roman Miller with the Canadian Latin American Alliance. Joining me is Bianca Mujenji of the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute. We will be your hosts for this evening. We'd like to thank Canadian Dimension who are sponsoring this event. Canadian Dimension is a leading voice of the left, offering alternative views on politics, economics, culture, and sports. You can find this event streamed on their Facebook page at CDN Dimension. Again, that's CDN Dimension. You can also use the hashtags elections for Bolivia and Bolivia protests on Twitter to discuss. There will be a Q&A portion at the end of the event, so be sure to send your questions by typing them into the Q&A box down here or in the live stream comment section on Facebook. Now I'd like to welcome our panelists. Oli Vargas, Bolivian journalist for Radio Causachun Coca and Causachun News. Guion Long, former Foreign Minister of Ecuador and analyst with the Center for Economic and Policy Research. And Matthew Green, NDP MP for Hamilton Center. Welcome. To start, I'd like to speak briefly about the Canadian Latin American Alliance and our work. The Canadian Latin American Alliance pursues the development of a relationship between Canada and Latin America that is based on principles of democracy, self-determination, and the defense of human rights. We do this work through public engagement, education, and lobbying. CLA works to ensure that Canada has a positive effect on democracy in the hemisphere and that Canadians work with groups and individuals who share the goal and dream of a truly progressive and democratic Latin America. Now on to Bolivia. I'll give a very quick synopsis of what's currently going on and what has happened or taken place in Bolivia since November of 2019. Evo Morales, the duly elected leader of Bolivia, was forced to flee the country after being removed by military leaders. Citing a report from the Organization of American States, the OAS, the claim was made that electoral fraud had taken place. Unfortunately, but not surprisingly, Canada was one of a number of countries to deny that a coup had taken place and quickly moved to recognize the de facto government of Jeanine Áñez. They denied that a coup had taken place, even though this was almost a textbook definition of a coup, like it has been in many other parts of Latin America before. Since the Center for Economic Policy Research produced a report that demonstrated that the OAS claims of electoral fraud were unfounded. There was no evidence to support such a claim. Bolivia had held truly democratic elections. However, this is not the narrative that the mainstream corporate media and the right-wing Bolivian leaders are continuing to push in the country. For those who haven't been following along since the very beginning when all of this began, once again, the coup took place in November of 2019, at which point the de facto president took over and promised that an election would take place in May of 2020. It is now August of 2020 and an election has not yet happened. 4 dates have been set for the election and still no elections. Bolivians are currently on the streets fighting for their democracy and the situation continues to escalate. Today, we will be answering some very important questions on this panel. How was Bolivia's first indigenous president overthrown? Why was Evo Morales overthrown? What is taking place in Bolivia right now? And what is the current state of affairs? And the overall stability in the country. And most importantly for our purposes here today in Canada, what is Canada's role in all of this? With that, I'd like to once again introduce my co-host, Bianca Mujenji of the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, who will talk about the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, the format of the event, and a little bit more of an introduction of our great panelists. Bianca?
Thank you, Ornella, for that excellent synopsis, and a huge thanks to the organizers and to the panelists for taking the time to be here with us. I'm very, very excited to be co-presenting this incredibly timely event. So in terms of how we're going to proceed, just a quick overview, we're going to start by hearing from the panelists individually. Then I'm going to hand it back to Ornella, who will be facilitating the discussion. And we'll begin with questions from selected journalists, and then we'll be taking some questions from the audience as well. So as Ornella mentioned, my name is Bianca Mujenji, and I'm with the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, which is a newly launched organization that challenges unjust foreign policy measures and aims to bridge the gap between the perception and the reality of Canada's role in the world. I imagine many of you who are tuned in may be interested to know that we're also organizing a historic event that the Canadian Latin America Alliance is actually co-sponsoring with us, featuring Venezuelan Foreign Minister Jorge Arieta on Canada's interference in Venezuela. So you can go to foreignpolicy.ca/Venezuela to find out more about that. So in terms of our work, Canada portrays itself as a benevolent actor on the international stage, but the facts often actually show otherwise. And we see this very, very clearly with Bolivia. Our institute recently spearheaded a campaign urging UN member states to vote no to Canada's bid for a United Nations Security Council seat. And among other issues that were cited, we had a point about Canada's role in Bolivia, arguing that Canada lent its support to the economic elites and Christian extremists who recently overthrew the country's democratically elected Indigenous president. Canada actually ultimately lost its bid, and quite badly. And given its international track record, this shouldn't have come as a big surprise. And so we really feel like this is a moment to reflect upon and demand a fundamental reassessment of Canadian foreign policy. And as we speak, Canada's policy towards Venezuela is looking ever more undemocratic with each passing day. There's a lot that's really quite unfortunate to note. For instance, just after Evo Morales was ousted in November, our Foreign Affairs Minister, Chrystia Freeland, released a statement noting, "Canada stands with Bolivia and the democratic will of its people. We note the resignation of President Morales and will continue to support Bolivia during the transition and the new elections," with no hint of criticism of Morales' ouster. Beyond this, Trudeau raised concerns about election regularities in Bolivia with Chile's president, and Ottawa lent support to the Organization of American States' efforts to discredit Bolivia's presidential election. So Canada has not been an innocent bystander, and the general strike has further exposed Canada's alliance. Trudeau is not on the right side of history. So it's amazing to see the reports from the ground of the resistance and the massive mobilizations happening across the country. And on that note, it gives me great, great pleasure to introduce Oli Vargas, someone I know a lot of us have been following online. Oli Vargas is a Bolivian journalist and writer covering the situation live in the country following the coup. Oli contributes to many sites, which can be found at Mint Press News, The Grey Zone, Telesur English, and Radio Causashuan News, Coca, and more. He recently launched Causashuan News, an English language news outlet, which is an increasingly important voice and an authority for on-the-ground news in Bolivia. So the link to this channel will be posted on the chat and the Patreon, so you can support there. Welcome, Oli.
Hello, okay, thank you very much. Thank you to everyone for organizing this event. It's an honor to speak alongside two great speakers on this issue. As many of you know, Bolivia has erupted since Monday of last week, 10 days ago. And the trigger of the mass uprising demanding the restoration of democracy was the forced suspension of the date of the elections, which was supposed to be a peaceful democratic route out of the current crisis the country's facing. And although that was the trigger, although that was the initial reason that people began mobilizing last week, in reality, this movement is a much broader, is about much broader issues that speak to all of the problems the country has faced since the coup in November of last year. One of the main demands is the restoration of the chance to elect a democratically legitimate government, because a democratically elected government wouldn't, for example, take out loans with the IMF, while the vast majority of Bolivians are losing their incomes and passing through levels of poverty and hunger that haven't been seen since for maybe 20 years during the worst moments of the neoliberal period before Evo Morales. It also speaks to, it's also a movement against the climate of authoritarianism and persecution that the people have been living under for 8 months. For example, all of the presidential candidate of the movement towards socialism, Evo Morales' party, and most of the senior Senate candidates have criminal charges pending against them for things like sedition, terrorism. You know, the union leader here where I am based in the tropical Cochabamba, and Andrónico Rodriguez, he's a Senate candidate for the Department of Cochabamba, and he has 5 separate charges. One of them is for sedition, for calling the government a coup government. This is a sort of environment that has been created for the mass, for the movement towards socialism. However, that persecution has extended far beyond the party, and it's begun to attack everyone who raises their head above the parapet. The outlet that I work for, Radio Causachum Coca, and more recently we launched Causachum News to speak to the international community. We faced constant attacks, constant threats. It's been an extraordinarily difficult way to work, to operate. We get calls from the military, from sympathetic military officers, you know, most weeks threatening to shut, well, telling us that there are plans to try and shut us down, to try and take out arrest warrants on our director, on staff. My colleague Landon Marca was arrested a couple of months ago while reporting on a workers' union event during the quarantine. Our officers in the city of Cochabamba were burned down by right-wing paramilitaries who have now reactivated to attack the ongoing protests. It's been a difficult period. It's been a period where anyone who wants to report on the abuses, the human rights abuses that have been taking place, who wants to talk about, for example, the massacres that were carried out after the coup, if you want to speak about those issues, you have to do so. You have to be incredibly careful. At any moment, you could get given charges for sedition, for terrorism. I personally get messages almost every day from right-wing coup supporters telling me that they've filed a report with the police for my seditious posts online, criticizing the government, questioning what they're doing. So people have been living through an intense economic crisis brought about through neoliberal reforms, through an IMF, a conditioned IMF loan, that through the near collapse of the country's state companies, and alongside that, have had to live after 14 years of indigenous rights, after 14 years of being able to speak, to organize, to march openly. It's now become an act of terrorism to do those things. So when the government suspended elections, once again, people, the fear that had been instilled in people sort of melted away. It melted away because people had so much hope for these elections, so much hope that finally we'd be able to, by peaceful means, to remove a government that has, within 9 months brought about the economic and social collapse of the country. And we wouldn't, no one would have to die. It'll take 1 day of voting, and we can once again have a legitimate government in the country. So when that was taken away, delayed for the 4th time in 3 months, people erupted. And I heard a lot of people abroad tell me, why are people annoyed about a delay in the vote? The delay is only a month and a half. Can't people hold on a month and a half? But the issue is not about a month and a half. People no longer have trust in the regime to be able to organize these elections. They know that the regime doesn't want to organize elections because they're third in the polls. They haven't done all of this, haven't launched the coup and changed the very nature of the state, the very political character of the state, just to leave quietly after a few months. They're trying to stay in power indefinitely and using the pandemic as an excuse to do that. So people erupted. People launched a general strike organized by the national labor unions, the Central Obrera Boliviana. That was a group that wasn't mobilized during the anti-coup resistance in November. They're now mobilized. This was also joined by the indigenous and rural workers, campesino unions in every single department in the country, the vast majority of whom were not mobilized for the anti-coup resistance in November. In November, the two main places where there was activity was in the city of El Alto and here in the tropical of Cochabamba. Now this is a national movement, reaching even the Amazonian departments of Pando and Beni, which are normally more conservative areas of the country. So this is an uprising on a mass scale, mostly in the rural areas, but also in the working class areas of the big cities, in El Alto, in the Zona Sur of Cochabamba, in Plan 3000 of Santa Cruz, people organizing to go on strike, organizing to block roads, which is the most important tactic at play right now. Almost all of the key highways in the country have been blocked by protesters erecting barricades on numerous points along these highways, essentially paralyzing the country, bringing the country to a standstill, as a means of showing the power of ordinary people over their country. Soon we'll see that those movements step up a gear, marching to the cities to protest in the cities, surrounding the cities in an action that brings back memories of Tupac Katari, the indigenous leader who fought the Spanish Empire by surrounding La Paz and trying to overthrow colonialism in that way. The same tactics are being used now. But the movement itself, although it's large, much larger than the anti-coup resistance in November, much bolder, much more confident, it faces a tough question, almost a split, if you like. On the one hand, you have Evo Morales and the mass and their leadership in the legislature and the most pro-mass sections of the social movements who say that their main demand is guarantees for free and fair elections as soon as possible. And they say they're willing to accept the new date, 18th of October, as long as it can be guaranteed by the UN and as long as there is an end to the persecution against leftists, an end to the persecution against mass candidates, an end to the attempts by the regime to ban the mass from standing altogether. Another section of the movement, the section that is mobilized but who wasn't so mobilized against the coup in November, sections of the indigenous movement that aren't so close to the mass, they've radicalized their demands much further. They're calling for the immediate ousting of the government, the overthrow of the government. This is particularly strong in the city of El Alto and in the rural areas around La Paz, where sort of historic leaders have come back into the fold and historic indigenous leaders come back into the fold to mobilize the rural areas, the indigenous rural areas, not as sort of sections, pro-mass sections, but as an entirety. 100% participation of communities, indigenous communities, and of the working class areas of the cities. So that unity has been key, but it also poses a dilemma of what should the people demand? Should people wait for elections or or take the government, take power, seize power? Obviously, for both questions, there's a lot of difficult things one has to answer. If you want free and fair elections as soon as possible, you've got to think about what guarantees would look like. What guarantees are you asking for? How does that happen? And how can that be respected in a government that is a dictatorship, that doesn't respect laws, doesn't respect rules? But then on the other side, if you call for the immediate ousting of the coup government, that's going to require a huge amount of conflict that will result in deaths, possibly lots of deaths. And you have to be able to take that responsibility and mobilize your people to face that, to go into that and possibly die. So these are the questions facing the movement right now. But at the end of the day, there's only three ways that this will end. This whole situation can end. First, which is the demand of the mass, free and fair elections with guarantees from international organisms. And that's the peaceful route out. That's the peaceful way to end the coup government and to restore democratic rule to Bolivia. The second option overthrow the government by force. And the third option is the state cracking down, crushing all of the protests, taking back the country by force. To do that will require a huge amount of violence because, as I said earlier, these protests are in every single region of the country, involving 100% of the rank and file of almost all of the unions, both urban and rural. So to defeat that would require a military invasion of the country in every region, every department. The bloodshed of that would be enormous. So what can be done? People always ask me, you know, in the UK or the US, Canada, etc. You know, what can I do as someone who stands in solidarity with Bolivia in this moment in the fight for democracy? Well, I think pressuring one's own government is incredibly important. We all know the role that the US, Canada, European Union played in rubber stamping the coup in Bolivia, in ignoring all of the human rights abuses that have been going on for 9 months. And now, you know, no one here is calling for the Canadian government to intervene, to take sides in the conflict. But what they should be doing is pressuring the Bolivian government to accept the peaceful option, to accept to organize elections in the conditions in which they can be free and fair. That is to say, to end all of the criminal charges, the fake invented criminal charges against mass candidates, to throw out the attempts to ban the mass from standing, and to ban mass candidate Luis Arce from standing, and to allow the elections to take place peacefully and as soon as possible, with no further delays. I think that's the most important thing that governments such as Canada, the UK, governments of the European Union can call for, can pressure. Because if the Bolivian government thinks they can do whatever they want and their allies in the West will turn a blind eye, then they'll come out tomorrow and start shooting. But if they feel like the international community is pressuring them to actually hold elections and follow through, then the country will be in a much better position. And the country could overcome this crisis in a peaceful, democratic way. The second thing I think the international community and governments like Canada need to do is to pressure the government to stop using paramilitary forces against protesters. Throughout this last week, we've seen the regime mobilize groups in the city of Cochabamba and Santa Cruz, far-right terrorist groups who are armed by the police themselves. In Cochabamba, that group is called the Resistencia Juvenil Cochala. And they come out with firearms on motorbikes to attack people at various points of roadblocks in the city. The same has been done in Santa Cruz, where they shot 3 people in the town of Santa Rosa de Roca. Fortunately, no one died. 3 people are in hospital right now because of gunshot wounds from these groups that have been backed by the state who are fighting on behalf of the regime. Yesterday, the Minister of Defense endorsed this group in Santa Cruz, saying that, you know, they know what they need to do and they need to send a message to Bolivia. That's the strategy. That's how they're repressing the protests, is by mobilizing these far-right terrorist paramilitary groups. So governments around the world, Canada and everywhere else, needs to say to the Bolivian government that you cannot use paramilitary. Like anywhere in the world, you need to stop sending irregular, unofficial groups in to kill those who criticize your government. If the international community can do that, then I think the social movements in Bolivia will be in a much better place. Be in a place where they can retake control for the country on behalf of the majority of the people, on behalf of the majority of people who don't want to live under a dictatorship, who don't want to live under a neoliberal economic system. And that is the root out of Bolivia's crisis. And that's something that I think everyone watching this, everyone from Canada or from other countries, can help with, to call on one's governments to do. That's a huge help for the people here fighting for democracy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ollie, for your talk. It's incredible to hear what's happening in Bolivia and hear your firsthand accounts as well. And also, you know, taking heed of your challenge to the international community and our own Canadian governments. We need to take that very seriously. We're very glad that you were able to make it here, you know, safe and sound to be able to do this event. And for anyone who wants to find out more about the work that Ollie is doing on the ground, please check out his Twitter at ovargas52. And we're gonna put a Patreon link in the chat as well. Thank you for your brave journalism, and we look forward to hearing more from you in the Q&A. So our next speaker is Guillaume Long. Guillaume Long is a former Ecuadorian politician, having held several cabinet positions in the government of Ecuador, including Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Culture, Minister of Knowledge and Human Talent. Guillaume holds a PhD in international politics from the University of London. He currently serves as a senior policy analyst at the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Welcome, Guillaume.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me. It's great to be able to share a few ideas, a few thoughts about what's going on in Bolivia and Latin America, these very, very troubled times in Latin America where there's a real, as Ollie was saying, there's a real authoritarian renewal or neoliberal authoritarianism, right? It's incredible because if you think of the 1960s and the 1970s in Latin America being marked by these authoritarian political projects, essentially military dictatorships, but not being necessarily neoliberal in kind, although neoliberalism started towards the end of that period under General Pinochet and the Argentine experiment. But by and large, 60s and 70s were kind of developmentalist with military rule. And then the 80s and the 90s were democratizing in Latin America. You had elections, you had civilian rule, but it was accompanied with the great neoliberal revolution that came to Latin America, you know, after Reaganomics and Thatcherism and all these things, right? And now we've got the worst of both worlds, right? We've got a return of authoritarian practice. Okay, they're not military dictatorships, but we've seen, including in the case of Bolivia, that the military is playing a big role in bolstering these authoritarian elite projects. And you've got the neoliberalism of the 1980s and 90s, which has always been disastrous for Latin America, these IMF recipes that we're seeing in Bolivia, that we saw until recently in Argentina, that we're seeing in Ecuador, that we're seeing elsewhere, with the growth of poverty. Just as a parenthesis, you know, between 2000 and 2012, during what is generally regarded as the pink tide in Latin America, 90 million people were lifted out of poverty, possibly up to 100 million people if you extend the date until 2014. There are clashing methodologies there. Out of 600 million Latin Americans, 100 million people lifted out of poverty is a big deal, right? In the last 3-4 years, with this return of neoliberal rule, 25 million people have gone back into poverty. And the big Latin American problem, which isn't only poverty actually, the big Latin American problem is inequality, right? Because inequality in a highly urbanized context, Latin America is very urbanized, the most urbanized region in the world, more than 65% of the population lives in big cities. Inequality in that context, and in the context of the absence of the state and strong institutions, it's just a lethal cocktail for all sorts of structural problems, including crime, violence, all sorts of things that we often associate with Latin America, and that have to do with that inequality, right? So, very troubled times in Latin America, troubled times in Bolivia and elsewhere, but particularly in Bolivia where the situation is really dire. And I want just to say how amazing it is to have brave people like Oli Vargas on the ground, who, for those of us who follow Bolivia closely, and I'm one of the people who I think does, you know, who give out information. And, you know, there's no information coming out of Bolivia because it's dangerous. Right? And there are very few journalists that do that work. And he's constantly informing us with subtle, clever journalism, not just like it's militant and it's activism, but it's also clever, nuanced. And that's really, really valuable. And he's in that first line of, you know, that first trenchy. And so good luck to you, Oli, and thanks so much for keeping us all in the loop in terms of what's going on in Bolivia, and please stay safe, be careful. We need you for the long haul here. I was going to talk briefly about our role here, because you mentioned it, Ornella, the role of the Center for Economic and policy research here in Washington, where I'm based. And the work we did on the past Bolivian elections, the Bolivian elections of October last year, which were deemed, considered fraudulent by the OAS. And this is relevant, of course, to Canada, because Canada is a member state of the OAS, the Organization of American States, and Canada endorsed, as the majority of states of the OAS. Unfortunately, the balance of power inside the OAS right now is really conservative. But Canada was one of the countries that endorsed the OAS report. The first report, the EOM report, the Electoral Observer Mission report, and then the special audit report that was released by the OAS denouncing, well, they don't usually use the word fraud because they do these technical reports, so they use the word intentional manipulation, right? But essentially fraud that they blamed on the Morales government in Bolivia. So just briefly, so you understand how politicized and how manipulated this was, I was just going to give you a broad panorama how this fraud also, how this accusation of fraud, also became the center pillar for the coup, and how it became the justification, the legitimization of a coup that unfolded a few weeks later. So elections were held on October 20th last year, 2019. All the polls pretty much, well, they all put Evo Morales in first place, and a number of them actually put Morales as the winner without a need for a runoff. This is important because in Bolivia, you can win presidential elections with just 40% of the vote, 40% or more of the vote, if you have a 10 points difference with the next candidate. So a lot of polls said, well, Morales probably not going to get 50%, but he would get high 40s, and he would definitely be 10 points ahead from Carlos Mesa. Now, on election day, this is pretty much what happened, but the margin of the 10 points was tight. And this is where there was a window of opportunity for essentially the Trump administration, but via the OAS, to question the electoral results and sow the seed of doubt and generate this whole kind of snowball effect towards a coup. So what happened there? Well, in Bolivia, you have, as in many electoral mechanisms in Latin America and elsewhere, you have two vote counting mechanisms. One of them is what we might call a preliminary count, which is, in Bolivia, it's called the TREP, and it's something that is done by taking pictures on the phone of the tally sheets all around the country and then sending it via a special app that all the people on the phones have, sending it to actually a private company in La Paz, so that the private company can really quickly sort of tally up the numbers and give the media, approximate but pretty close results, so that the media can announce these results on the night of the election. You don't have to wait the next day. Now, most of the time, because it's not as precise as the official count, which takes longer to compute, and because it's based on an app and there's different coverage in the country and so on and so forth, it is understood that this preliminary count will be done with 80% of tally sheets. So once you have 80% of the tally sheets, the photos have been taken, they've been sent on this app to La Paz, you get a pretty good idea of what the electoral trend's going to be, especially if there's a big difference, right? Which the other 20% is not going to be, really, isn't it? Mathematically, it's not going to happen. The trend's not going to change. In this case, Morales is clearly above 40%. In fact, in the end, the result gave him above 47%. But Carlos Mesa, the second candidate, was on 36.5 in the end. So it was tight. The 10 points was tight. So on the night of the elections, the people who were doing the electoral authorities stopped the TREP at 83% of the tally sheets. Now, stopping the TREP at 83% of the tally sheets is entirely legal. There's no problem with that. The contract was minimum 80, so they did that. There was no wrongdoing there. But they stopped when the margin between the two candidates was still 7.9%. So insufficient for Morales to win outright without the need for a runoff. The next day, when the counting was resumed, Morales went past the 10-point difference, and going past the 10-point difference, was essentially winning in the first round without the need for a runoff. And this is when the OAS, the day after the elections, on the 21st of October, spoke of a drastic and inexplicable change of trend in the vote count in Bolivia. Drastic and inexplicable change of trend in the vote count. So, Morales from having 8 points difference, 7.9 points different, to Morales having over 10 points different, which above the threshold, making him the winner in the first round. Now, I myself have been an observer for the OAS. I was actually in 2017, the head of the OAS electoral observation mission in Bolivia, so I know both the OAS and the Bolivian electoral system quite well. And I can tell you it's highly irregular for the OAS to come out the day after an election with a really aggressive statement, press release, questioning this highly drastic and inexplicable change of trend, and actually calling for a second round to be held. This is a political decision, right? The OAS is a technical body, and at least the electoral observation institution within the OAS, the DECO, is a technical technical body that's there to make technical comments, not to make political comments and call for a second round of elections. That's not at all for the OAS to do. The OAS normally, the normal thing that the OAS does, the OAS observes elections, and then on the last day or the day after the elections, the day before they leave, they do what is called a preliminary report, a press conference, usually using very cautious and moderate language. And then a few months later, they present the final report of the electoral observation to the Permanent Council of States in Washington, right, where Canada sits, right? But sort of an aggressive press release saying that this is highly irregular, or in other words, and like sowing doubt, this is highly irregular. I've been following OAS electoral observation missions for years. I've been involved in them myself. This immediately caught our attention as there was something fishy. So we started looking, in the center we have mathematicians and statisticians, and so we started looking at what the OAS meant by this. And we started looking at previous elections, and we realized that the pro-Morales vote, the pro-mass vote, tends to be counted later on. If you look at all the last elections, there is a leap in the last 20% of the vote count, sometimes up to 3–4% leap in favor of mass. Why? Because the late vote, the votes that are late reported, tend to come from more rural areas, from more peripheral areas, from poorer areas, and these votes obviously tend to favor Morales and the mass, right? So there was nothing unusual here. It happened last time. Even in the referendum that Evo Morales lost, he was first, when on 81% of the vote count, he was losing the referendum by 42%. 43%. By the time 100% of the vote came in, he lost the referendum, but he lost in a much tighter margin. I think he lost by 48%, right? So this was, it happened in previous presidential elections. It happened in previous parliamentary elections. The mass and the Morales vote came in later. Now, the OAS is a highly technical body, with 90 observers, with lots of people doing statistics and maths. This could not have been a mistake. We couldn't fathom it here at the center. And when you say change of trend in the electoral results, for example, in Honduras, there was a change of trend. And in Honduras, you had fraudulent elections. Why? Because in the morning, municipality A voted in favor of someone, and in the afternoon, municipality A, so the same place, the same voting center, they voted for somebody else. So that is weird. That is strange. There's the village voting for someone in the morning and someone in the afternoon, someone different in the afternoon. That is a change of trend. But you can't have a change of trend if it's because the precincts are not being reported all at the same time. And some, I mean, anybody that's watched election night on CNN in the United States or whatever, whichever country in the world, will understand that sometimes you have to wait for certain votes to come from certain areas before able to call the state or to call the mayor, or because you know that those votes are going to be heavy, either right wing or left wing or whichever, they will change the results. And that's exactly what happened. So we published a first paper in which we demonstrated that the votes that hadn't been counted were pro-Morales votes, and that there was nothing fishy, nothing suspicious there. The OAS completely blanked us, and unfortunately, the member states of the OAS did not question this, and of course, the media replicated this notion that there had been fraud. Had all the kind of mainstream corporate media in the US, in Canada, in the European Union, and elsewhere in Latin America, sort of sowing the doubt of fraud. This radicalized the Bolivian opposition, who was already, there was already a polarized, it was already a polarized election in Bolivia, but this kind of polarization with these accusations of fraud became more radical, more violent. Demonstrations in the streets grew. It created the perfect scenario for a coup. Eventually, the Bolivian government went back to the OAS and said, possibly naively, there's a debate to be had here, there's no wrongdoing, please come back, send a special audit mission. So the OAS, the member states of the OAS, agreed to sign a special agreement to send a new team of experts to Bolivia, and the new team of experts in Bolivia went back on the 31st of October, so just 11 days after the elections, and stayed there until the 10th of November, when they released a new audit report. And essentially, methodologically, anybody that's done electoral observation, when I speak to my colleagues, it's scandalous, right? It's an audit report. So the statistical lie, the initial lie of the change of trend, allowed them to open this Pandora's box of what I call the big soup of irregularities, right? They just threw some irregularities in there just, to make the elections look bad. Every election in the world has irregularities, including in the United States and Canada and Europe. In Latin America, the kind of irregularities that are identified in Bolivia are very recurrent, common irregularities. And the report showed no proof of intentional manipulation, no proof of fraud. Just to give you a very brief idea, I don't want to be too technical, but there is a number of ways of doing fraud, right? One way of doing fraud is to tweak the numbers, to change the numbers in the computer system. Right? You get into the system and you change the numbers, and doing fraud is to do fraud with the physical material, the tally sheets, the numbers on paper that are being sent from all the different electoral centers in the country. Now, one way of making sure there is no fraud is to take the physical tally sheets and to take the computer system and compare these things, right? This is pretty simple, essential tasks that you would expect an audit team to do. They didn't do that. Although, in a footnote on page 83, I believe, of the OAS audit report, there is a recognition that 800 tally sheets, there was an initial sample of 4,000 tally sheets and then 2,007 tally sheets. They don't explain how they chose that sample. And then 800 tally sheets were actually checked. But they don't tell us what the results of this was. So obviously, if they'd found some discrepancy between the tally sheets themselves and the computer system, this would have been the mother of all proofs that there was fraud, and they would have put it in the front page of their paper. It would have been their main evidence. There was no evidence there. Another thing that they accuse the Bolivian electoral process, one of the irregularities they identify is the fact that in 226 tally sheets. Now, there were 37,000 tally sheets in the Bolivian elections, 37,000 tally sheets. Now, in 226, so a tiny amount, they found that one or more people had filled in 226 tally sheets. So what does that mean? It means that in 226 cases, there are several people that have filled more than one tally sheet. So the average is like 2 or 3 tally sheets per person in these two. It's not one person that filled in 226 tally sheets, because that would have been suspicious. It's one person that filled in 2 or more tally sheets, usually 2 or 3 tally sheets, right, with a number. So what's the tally sheet? It's, you know, the number of the votes once you open the amphora and you count the votes, and so in 226 cases, right? But, you know, if you look at where this happened in really rural villages, very indigenous villages, villages where the first language, where there are often high illiteracy rates, when the first language isn't Spanish, and, you know, one person filling the tally sheet on this table, but also filling the tally sheet on the table right across in the same classroom is not a proof of fraud. And it clearly shows you know, a lack of anthropological understanding of what's going on here. And if that's an element of fraud, then I don't know a single election in Latin America that hasn't been fraudulent. Because it's clear that someone wasn't, you know, someone who was in charge of that table there, of putting the numbers in the tally sheets, wasn't confident enough to do it. So maybe, I can just picture it, right? And some adolescent who's literate filling in the tally sheets on that table and the tally sheets on that other table in 2 or 3 cases max. The OAS knows this. They've seen this in Haiti. They've seen this in the Andes. They've seen this in Central America, and they've never cried fraud. So instead of becoming less suspicious with this evidence that was being provided by the OAS, we became more suspicious because it was just absurd. And then finally, they made a lot of noise in the media about these secret servers that are connected to the system towards the end. Well, we had a look at the secret servers. The OAS never actually opened the logs of the secret servers, despite the fact that all the logs are available. Again, you would expect an audit to look at the logs of the election. That's kind of a minimal requirement. If you're going to do a computer audit, you look at the logs. And this essentially, the person connecting is essentially the owner, the manager, whatever, of the company that was running the preliminary results, just checking everything's fine. Yeah. Again, if that is an element of fraud, you know, there is no Latin American election that has been clean, free and fair in the last decades. But worse than that, their only accusations are on the preliminary count mechanism. Remember, I told you there were 2 mechanisms counting votes, the preliminary one so that you could give results on the night of the elections, and the official binding results, which take several days. Well, all the accusations were on the preliminary results, which are not legal, not binding, and in any event, they gave out the same results as the binding official results in the end. So, cut a long story short, technically, which is what we did a 100-page report. We really tried to position it with the press. I think we proved that at least the OAS had not proven intentional manipulation. And we started speaking to different actors, trying to interest other people in studying this. We were all alone at the beginning. The media wasn't listening to us. Only some alternative media was like listening to our story. Eventually, the MIT election lab in Boston, they have an election lab. 2 researchers there got interested. They found the same results as us, and they published a paper in the Washington Post. So that got the ball rolling a little bit. And then the New York Times, who had been lobbying to do their own research, that we weren't, you know, this was technical, it wasn't political, eventually hired University of Pennsylvania and University of Tulane, these researchers to do the research. They found the same results as us. And so now you have this kind of academic consensus, at least in the United States, saying that the OAS wrote a report which is full of lies, full of methodological and scientific problems. And there's a real consensus now in the electoral observer community and in the academic community in the United States. And it's starting to be picked up by the mainstream press. The New York Times had an article not long ago saying that the elections might not have been fraudulent after all. The Washington Post, and when you have those, then you have others, and CNN, and so on. You're getting gradually the mainstream media foreign policy blob to start moving, right? With tremendous effort, and of course, much too late. because in the meantime, on the day the audit was made public, or at least the preliminary results of the OAS audit was made public, well, the coup happened, right? The military asked Morales to resign in Bolivia. And a non-elected government came in, and as we've just seen, we just heard from Ollie, the extent to which that non-elected government intends to stay in power, and the changing the election dates now 4 times in a row, and so on, and all the authoritarian practices and the arrest and the persecution taking place. It's amazing also to think that the electoral authorities of the last elections are in jail. Right? The electoral authorities are in jail for fraud. They still haven't been tried because it's taking ages. But loads of people are being persecuted on the basis of fraud, a fraud which the OAS showed no evidence happened. Right? What can we do? I mean, I think it's important for the whole story to be out there, which is why we still insisted on the problem of origin. Yeah. The birth of this de facto government based on this fraudulent report from the OAS, which was completely supported by the United States, completely endorsed by Canada. And it's really important that we pressure the United States, Canada, and the member states of the OAS, and some observer states of the OAS, including members of the European Union, because there was also a very small European Union mission. And I think one thing that legislators can do, members of parliament can do, is to ask questions. So, for example, here in the United States, a number of congressmen and women sent letters to the OAS asking technical questions about, how come they come to the conclusion of fraud, and asking very precise questions about the stats and the maths of it, and the irregularities. The OAS has refused to answer Congress, and this in the United States is seen as a big affront, as a big insult. This is the pressure we can pile up, because at the end of the day, it's about Bolivia, but it's not just about Bolivia. It's about the OAS. It's about the fact that the OAS is going to observe at least 5 electoral processes next year, starting with an electoral process in my country, in Ecuador, in February. And yeah, the OAS is not a legitimate observer that is biased. And then when you have someone like Almagro, the Secretary General of the OAS, who himself is pressured by Pompeo and by Trump to organize a coup in Bolivia, then you can clearly not trust the OAS as an impartial observer. It's likely to repeat the trick in other parts of Latin America. It's likely to politicize its electoral observation mission and use it as a tool when the opportunity arises to overthrow government or to overrule the will of the people. So I would invite you all to exert pressure on your government and on the Canadian government to ask questions from the Canadian government in terms of why it is considered that there was no coup, that there was no fraud, there was a fraud and no coup in Bolivia, and this can also be done through parliamentarians getting together, asking questions of the government, but also asking questions of the OAS, because Canada is a member state, and therefore Canadian legislative space is also the legislative space of the OAS. And that's that for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Guillaume, for your introductory remarks. That was a real education. I'm sure everyone here will agree. And it's really something to hear about the details of the meticulous work that you've done to debunk these electoral accusations. And also thanks for so generously and brilliantly explaining this to us. I saw a lot of light bulbs going off in the chat as you explained this. So yeah, thank you for being a powerful voice and calling for the restoration of democracy and the rule of law in Bolivia. And looking forward to hearing more from you in the discussion. And I just want to remind folks at home in the audience, don't forget to support on social media. Look for our hashtags and tweets in the chat online. Let's do what we're being asked to do and spread the word and hold our governments accountable. So our next speaker is Matthew Green. I'm excited to present Matthew. In 2019, Matthew was elected Member of Parliament for Hamilton Centre. He previously made history when he became the first person of color elected to Hamilton City Council in 2014. He has a political science and legal studies degree from Acadia University, as well as Harvard Kennedy School of Government and Harvard Business School. And he's also the NDP critic for National Revenue, Public Services and Procurement, and deputy critic for ethics. Welcome, Matthew.
Thank you so much for having me. And I think it's probably wise for me just to check in with you facilitators, with both of you, to just see about the time. If you want, I can take less time and open it up for questions. But I just want to check in on where we're at with the time, if that's okay.
You know, I would say if you're able to, we would like to try and have at least, at least 20 minutes for a Q&A with journalists and the audience. But I'm also so extremely excited to hear all of the things that you want to say. So,
fair enough. So is that like 5-10 minutes? Is that what I got?
Yeah, about 10 minutes.
Cool. Well, I just want to begin by echoing Guillaume's concern for Ollie. Ollie, if you are still on the line, I definitely sense the urgency in your reporting and the danger of being on the front lines in such an incredibly contentious and volatile situation in Bolivia. So I do want to send you solidarity, and I want to thank Guillaume for such an incredibly comprehensive and technical deconstruction of what exactly transpired. My remarks are not going to come from that place. I don't pretend to be an expert on Bolivian politics, but I will comment on my observations as a member of parliament on the history, the contextual history of Canada and our foreign policy in terms of where we're at now. I will state that I'm not the critic for foreign affairs, but I did talk to Jack Harris, and he's certainly in concordance with most of what I'm about to say. So for those that are watching, and if this comes in the next campaign opposition video, make sure to take note. So to be clear, and recognizing the people that are already on this call who probably well know this, Canada was in fact founded on a Christian dominionist state. It is a settler colonial state that was founded on terra nullius, the idea that the Indigenous peoples of these lands in Canada were not considered to be human or equal in the same regards as the European settlers. That is the foundation of our country. That will always be the foundation of our country. And, officially, we're still a dominion. We're still a dominion of Canada. And it's this idea for me of what Christian dominionism looks like in a contemporary context. This idea that creation, that these people are chosen to subdue the earth and rule over all of its creatures, for me was most present when the government was seized by Jeanine Áñez and she walks in with the Bible over her head. That was striking for me, knowing that her government in Bolivia had basically put forward a decree that exempted the military of any legal responsibility for abuses committed during the repression. And I believe that was early on, sometime back in November. So myself as a member of parliament certainly made the statement that anybody who was complicit with her and what I call Christo-fascist regime during this coup would be complicit in these crimes and whatever is to come. And that is especially what's played out. But it's not unique to Bolivia. As is noted here, this has happened across Latin American countries and of course around the world with this idea of dominionism or imperialism. I think what is especially interesting or especially relatable to the Canadian context is the tie-in with its fueling of white supremacy and its attack on the very nature of indigeneity of Bolivia, the very nature of indigenous governance and what that might look like. And, I think for many Canadians who certainly are not paying attention in Bolivia, who are not paying attention to any foreign affairs matters really during this COVID crisis, there's still in Canada, I believe, very much maple-washed version of this Lester B. Pearson peacekeeping effort. We cloak ourselves in it. We use it to juxtapose ourselves from what is the wretched, ghoulish governments to the south in the United States of America under the past successive regimes. But certainly to see Canadian officials locked step with Pompeo and Trump, with our former prime minister involved in the International Democratic Union, kind of pushing this type of neo-colonial, like white supremacist foreign policy, is very troubling. And my position is that Canada's role, if Canada is to achieve what I think most everyday aspirational Canadians want, or at least see themselves as, which is these honest brokers of peace, then we ought not be involved in organizations like the Lima Group and like the OAS. And it doesn't take too much research to find the OAS's principles of combating communism and socialism. That is like still de facto what they're all about, to disrupt anti-capitalist movements around the world, to whether we call it neoliberalism or imperialist capitalist like corporatism, that it is about ensuring that there is no indigenous led resistance on national resources, the nationalization of resources. And so, so here we are. But I don't think it's surprising for anybody to see that somebody like Chrystia Freeland would back this regime. When you hear the quotes at this time, when she was basically front and center on this, she's now the deputy prime minister. And this is the same person who commended interim President Guaido for his courage and leadership in his efforts to return democracy to Venezuela. So this is who they are. This is both the conservative governments in Canada, the liberal governments in Canada, which are, intrinsically linked to the Bay Street mining sector, to the corporate class of this country. And anything that goes outside of those mandates, they will directly intervene in regime change. They will interfere with the sovereign, fair, free, democratic election processes of any country around the world. And we've seen that. Our foreign affairs critic says, Jack Harris says he noted right off the bat that the government of Canada very quickly recognized the changeover. And it appeared to be supporting the change, like supporting the regime change. We shouldn't be doing that. If we are who we like to say we are, if we're going to be a lapdog for the Trump regime and Pompeo, then that's another story. But we're in this situation where, unfortunately, most of the attention in the House of Commons has been domestically focused on COVID recovery. We've been disrupted in our ability to really engage in debates or parameters outside of that framework, particularly over the last 4 months. But I think that there ought to be a strong, particularly in the present context, a very strong international condemnation of what's happening there. And to Guillaume's point with the Center for Economic Policy and Research, when they report, I guess it's reported on the recent television broadcast, that the Defense Interior Minister Arturo Murillo repeatedly threatened harsh violence against protesters and said that it would be politically correct to shoot them. This is what our government is complicit with. This is a proto-fascist or a Christian dominionist conquest of indigenous peoples and working class peoples of Bolivia. We ought to have nothing to do with that. So, from my perspective, I think it is important. We're fourth party opposition. I'm not going to pretend that, that we hold government, but we're in a minority. There is opportunities for us to, to be active on this file. And I know that there's certainly a really strange rhetoric in the House of Commons, particularly led by this International Democratic Union that is xenophobic, that is very quick to condemn China. Henry's got, one of the attendees who's on here now, has a petition that outlines all the different countries that Canada has sanctions for. you know, and then we're keeping these sanctions during COVID, which is horrible. I'm going to share that. I'm going to share that petition in the chat and ask people to go ahead and sign that. That's one of the ways that we can introduce this onto the floor. We will have opportunity once House resumes for member statements. We will have opportunities for the Foreign Affairs Committee to kind of resume in a more fulsome way conversations there. And my hope, I guess I should share with you that my fear is that it's not too late. My fear that we don't leave this conversation too late before significant violence erupts. And I think Ollie was quite right in identifying the two choices, because when you watch the mass movements that are happening in Bolivia through the labor movement and locally on the ground there, and the subsequent kind of brown shirt proto-fascist response from these militias, one could only anticipate that without a peaceful exit, without a peaceful resolution, without a commitment to open and free and fair elections, that violence will in fact escalate. And my hope is that we can work together in these upcoming weeks to increase the pressure locally here, to tie liberals, and now I guess it'd be Minister Philippe Champagne-Francois, to the atrocities that will potentially erupt there. I think that that's a very important thing for us to do. I want to thank the Canadian Latin American Alliance, the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, Canadian Dimensions for doing this work. This is not work, this is not news in mainstream media in Canada, I don't think at all. And so it's important to have the alternative and independent outlets reporting what's happening on the ground and connecting with folks like Ollie and Mr. Long for, you know, a deeper analysis. So, you know, from my perspective, we're a long way from the Pearson peace years, and we have been complicit and active in imperialist wars on behalf of all of our oil and gas, mining sector, corporate interests around the world, and that needs to stop. So I think I'll end it there, and feel free to answer any questions that I can to the best of my ability.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Matthew, just for expressing such a bold stance as well. It's incredibly encouraging. And of course, thanks for all the work that you've done to insist that Canada denounce rather than legitimate Bolivia's military coup. So I'm now going to hand over to Ornella, who's going to be facilitating the question and answer period. And we're gonna get in as much as we can.
Thanks, Bianca. Thank you so much for all those great introductions. Now we'll move over to the question and answer part of the panel. You can send your questions, as I see that you've been doing quite a bit here in the chat box, or you can also send your questions in the live stream on the Canadian Dimension Facebook page at CDN Dimension, which is also being monitored. I ask that you keep your questions short and concise, and that you direct your questions to a specific panelist, and that you send questions as opposed to statements. So I have the first question is from Radhika Desai, a member of the Canadian Dimensions Coordinating Committee and a professor in the Department of Political Studies at the University of Manitoba. And Radhika will be asking her own question. Radhika, what is your question?
Yes, hi. Thank you first of all to the Alliance for holding this, for the Canadians, for the Institute on Canadian Foreign Policy, and Nella and all the hosts. My question is a little bit esoteric, perhaps. It tries to dig a little deeper. We know that I'm trying to understand the motivations behind the coup. Why would Canada, the United States, other Western countries support this coup? You guys have gone on and rightly explained the situation about the elections, but I want to say, you know, what happened afterwards and what explains that? We know that everybody's been talking about these rare earth metals, which are used in batteries and so on. And we know also that in the current context, where the West is ranged against China to a substantial extent, in this situation, China has a fairly large deposits of these metals, whereas the West does not. if I'm right, although please correct me if I'm wrong, what light can you shed on the motivations of Canada, the US, and other Western countries and the coup in Bolivia to get access to these minerals? And in addition, and by the way, this is directed to all the three speakers. I appreciate everybody's presentations. I think they were excellent. And I just would like to hear from everybody what they think of also the specifically Canadian interest in it. As we know, Canada is very much a type of capitalism that is based on extracting minerals. So there may also be other minerals that Canadian companies are interested in. So what are the interests involved? If you may please shed a bit of light on that.
So maybe since the question directed at all three panelists, we'll start in the order of the introduction. So we'll go with Ollie, Guion, and Matt.
So the question of why the coup happened, the US government in particular has been trying to promote a coup in Bolivia for a very long time. In 2008 and 2009 was the last big attempt to launch a coup, when the eastern half of the country, the right-wing factions within the eastern half of the country sort of declared their secession to try and stop the nationalization of natural gas and those sorts of things. And that movement, that sort of separatist movement, racist movement that had the involvement of the groups I talked about at the beginning, paramilitary groups, that was funded. WikiLeaks cables have since shown that was funded to the tune of $4 million, that money being funneled to them via USAID and these sorts of organizations. So the motivation in general has always been there. However, the Bolivian government was able to defeat those attempts. However, I think Western powers saw their opportunity in 2019. Evo Morales has been governing for a long time. The sort of media, which is uniformly right-wing in Bolivia, entirely, the only Evo Morales into that election with the only media that was, had an editorial line supportive of him was his own state media. Isn't so widely accessed around the country. It wasn't so widely watched and read around the country. So that media campaign against Evo Morales had reached such a level of aggression that gave the ground for middle-class groups in sort of the rich areas of the big cities to launch a set of quite violent protests, and that caused chaos to the point at which the military could step in and say, well, we just want to stop the chaos, and Evo Morales has to leave. We're ordering, that's the order. So that's how the coup happened, but I think there's all sorts of motivations. Political one is that Bolivia was the fastest growing economy in the region under Evo Morales, under an indigenous government that nationalized the country's natural resources and strategic industry. The US can't tolerate that in its own backyard. A good example, a government with socialist policies that created the fastest growing economy in the region, something recognized by the US Federal Reserve, by the IMF, by the World Bank. It was unanswerable. So that wasn't convenient for the US, for Canada, for other countries to have a model for developmentalist politics in a region of neoliberal governments that have been in the grips of an economic crisis for an incredibly long time. So I think that's certainly a political motive. Economic motive, as you said, is the issue of lithium in particular. Lithium is set to be produced and industrialized under a state-owned company, YLB, in partnership with a German company that would have a minority control of the process of industrialization. So the majority would have stayed under Bolivian control. Now that contract has been cancelled, and the government says, the new government say that they want to invite numerous foreign companies in to help develop that. I'm sure many people will have seen the sort of outburst that Elon Musk has had around this, but there are huge interest in opening up Bolivia's lithium reserves to foreign companies and stop Bolivia from industrializing within the country, and to instead export the lithium as a raw material so it can be industrialized elsewhere, and the profits or profit added products can be sold from other Western companies. So yeah, I think there's this huge interest in that. There's huge areas of mining that state owned in Bolivia. You know, Canada has mining concessions throughout this region, so I'm sure they're worried on that as well.
And now we'll go with Guillaume.
Yeah, so I mean, I actually agree with Ollie, and I didn't know we were finishing so soon. I'm sorry if I took any time away from Matthew. It wasn't my intention at all. I thought we had another half hour. But very briefly, I agree with Ollie. I think this is a coup of opportunity. It's not necessarily that well planned. We don't have to have a huge conspiracy theory on the actual planning of the coup, but there was an opportunity, you know, that whether, you know, it was going to be close to 10 points that Morales needed to win in the first round. And so they saw an opportunity there, grabbed it for all the reasons that Ollie mentioned. I mean, more than economic interests, I think there are economic interests, but I think more than economic interests, you know, it's the culture of empire in the US. It's amazing. You know, it's the return of Monroeism is such a huge pull. You had for 15 years, by and large, first decade and a half of the 21st century, a group of Latin American countries, for the first time in Latin American history, you know, a big group, you know, depending on who you include in that group and what's left and what's not left, between 10, 11, and 14 countries that were left of center, some of them moderate left, some of them quite radical and revolutionary left. That had never happened in the history of Latin America, and enabled Latin America to engage with the world in a completely different manner, to redistribute, to create even integration mechanisms, UNASUR, which is now being completely disintegrated and destroyed, in order to relate with the United States, not with the typical age-old bilateralism, race to the bottom competition with my neighbor, but unified. You know, to break that divide and rule approach that the US had always had towards its backyard, right? Which is what, you know, the name in itself is quite a clear indication of what the US policy was. And so the left in Latin America hasn't been forgiven by Washington for daring to do this, right? For daring to go against key tenets of the of international neoliberal governance. And Bolivia was one of the more radical elements in pink tide in that leftist alliance. So what we're seeing everywhere in Latin America is a geopolitical turn, orchestrated or guided from Washington for the right to return in power. And it's done in different ways. When you have someone that can win elections, they prefer that outcome. But when you don't, you know, lawfare, judicial persecution, we saw it against Cristina in Argentina, Lula in Brazil, Correa in Ecuador, or outright coups. There was one in Honduras in 2009, one in Paraguay in 2012, a kind of more sophisticated parliamentary coup against Dilma in 2016 in Brazil, and now one in 2019, a good old-fashioned military one in 2019 in Bolivia. Geopolitics, I think, and this vision of empire that the US has of controlling their hemisphere almost as a precondition, and they see this in their national security doctrine in the US. You know? In order to be able to project US power across the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, you need not a democratic, not a prosperous hemisphere, but a docile hemisphere. And that's national security doctrine, right? And so back to docility, back to, surrogate states. I think that's why the coup happened.
And if I could just briefly comment on what I believe Canada's role is, and it is not necessarily for empire, but for straight up Bay Street interest. Like if you look at where most of the international financing comes from for mining, you know, and Canada's role in mining around the world, it's very clear. We are an extractionist, capitalist, imperialist country. Again, it doesn't, you know, I don't think anybody's even trying to hide that fact. So for me, I think, you know, it's fascinating to see Canada involved in the OAS amongst all these Caribbean and Latin American countries, and funding it to the way that it does, proportionate, of course, to its population with the states. But for these organizations to be funded in such a way that really usurps any kind of international law, you know, the UN, the spirit of the UN. I would echo Ornella's, I don't know if it was Ornella or Bianca's statement that, yeah, it serves them right to lose that seat at the UN Security Council. that they can't operate alongside rogue states, overthrowing governments, interfering and democratically. Like, the world is sophisticated enough to know that if it's happening in Bolivia today, or Venezuela, yesterday, or Brazil 2 years ago, that it could be any one of them at any given time. The uncertainty and instability of the kind of global political climate right now, there are no rational actors. So that would be my suggestion, and it's right on brand for the Liberal Party, right on brand for them. Say one thing publicly in terms of humanitarian efforts, and then back, Christo-fascist coups.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'll just move along here. So we have about 10-15 minutes left. So the next question is from Camila Escalante of Telesur English. Camila?
Hey there, guys. Just let me know if you can hear me before I start.
We can, yes.
Okay, fabulous. Okay, so I'd love to ask each of you a question, but I can't, and I'll modestly just turn to Guillaume for just one question. So electoral authorities of the previous elections, as you said, are in jail now. We saw them being shamefully arrested and taken into custody. So in terms of preparation that goes into an election, are there not serious questions now as to how foolproof the electoral system is now with this new DSC? And what sort of international electoral observation can take place from within Bolivia now in the lead up to the elections amid what is largely still a lockdown in much of Latin America? How much observation are we going to have, both from people who are Bolivian and also international delegations? How will they be able to observe this election? Are we assuming that it's going to open up by the time, by this date, whether it be October 11th or 18th?
Yeah, that's a great question. And unfortunately, I don't really have very optimistic remarks. I mean, OAS is going to go back. They've already announced their will to go back and observe the elections, but we saw what they did in the last elections. I don't know. I mean, the OAS haven't always been this evil. So we'll have to see. I mean, in terms of electoral monitoring elections, they're actually the kind of, which is why they were the cleanest part of the OAS. I dislike the organization, but the electoral monitoring was pretty technical. They were kind of liberals who believed in free and fair election, but this time they got completely manipulated by politics, and they wanted to do a job, and they did. Right, so that's unacceptable, and they should be punished for it until there's a real audit of their behavior, and the member states of the OAS ask for them to be accountable, and there to be resignations, and it has to be a big deal, a big crisis for the OAS. This crisis hasn't happened. Same director of the electoral observation unit in the US is still there, defending his role, despite the fact that he lied, and we demonstrated on numerous occasions. So it's bad. It's going to be the OAS. Now, the European Union is going as well to observe. Last time they played a nefarious role, but there are some voices in the European Parliament, which is a relatively weak parliament, unfortunately. There has been some noise inside the European Union. In fact, I've interacted with some people that are quite mainstream, even on the right in the European Union, who are kind of uncomfortable with what happened in Bolivia. So there might be a ray of hope there that they might decide to play a technical as opposed to a political role, because electoral observation is supposed to be technical. And then the last, I mean, they're always kind of parties invite observers, so the mass is inviting observers. They don't have the same kind of access as the official observer missions, as OAS, EU. So it's tough. I mean, if there's a huge difference, as the poll suggests, between the mass candidate, which could win again in the first round without the need for a runoff, with more than 40% of the vote, right, and a 10-point lead on the next candidate. If there's a huge difference, then in order to do fraud against that, when there's a huge difference, it's much more difficult. Fraud usually occurs when the results are close, and you can play on this and play on that. Yeah, so that's the only hope for the mass to for those of us who want the mass to win, for the mass to really win convincingly. It would be very difficult for the electoral authorities to revert that. But it's important to know, as you said, the electoral authorities currently essentially, well, the president of the TSE, the electoral authority, was named by Áñez herself. There's been a few friction between him and Áñez in the last few months, but still, you know, he's a clear representative of the right, and he's not someone to be trusted. So we need to be vigilant. That's all I can say, really, and yeah, and make sure that we're just this journalism, like what Ollie's doing, and actors present there are making as much noise as possible, so that they can't get away with fraud or with reverting the will of the people in the ballot booth.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for that. So I'll go on to the next question. This is from Andre Denise, contributing editor at Maclean's. Andre?
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for having me. It's great to be here with you all, and it's a pleasure to share this information. And Ollie, I got to say, stay safe out there, brother. I know that this is an incredibly difficult time. My question is actually directed towards Matthew Green. And the reason I'm going to ask this question is because it hasn't been completely clear what the NDP stance here is. For example, if we were to go back to last year, the elections were on the 28th of October. I believe it was the 23rd or close to it that the elections results were essentially tossed away, and there was going to be support for a new election. But it wasn't until the 14th of November, it wasn't until 2 days after Jeanine Áñez held that Bible over her head the size of a telephone book and made the march into the presidential office, where Jagmeet Singh sent out a tweet saying the worsening situation in Bolivia is alarming. But then he followed up with a tweet saying that the Canadian government must support a new election that includes all parties. So it's not clear why there was a support for a quote-unquote new election when that seemed to have never been the intent in the first place. And we're still not clear, especially based on the moneyness for the OAS report, why there was even a need for it in the first place. So my question is, what is the official NDP position on the ouster of Evo Morales? What is the official NDP position on the upcoming elections? And assuming that there are, quote unquote, free and fair elections, what outcome are you hoping?
Sorry. I can't speak to what the party leader said, but I can speak to what our critic of foreign affairs said, that Canada should be going out of its way to ensure that what happened in Bolivia in the fall is something that the Bolivian people actually want. That it's unfortunate that Canada played a role in the process that led to a change in government. This came directly from foreign affairs critic Jack Harris. So he condemned the fact that the Canadian government was very quickly recognizing the changeover and the change, and he said, "I don't think we should be doing that." Quote. So that would be, I mean, you've heard my position. I think my position has been fairly clear, but I'll share once again that this hasn't been a conversation that has come to our caucus meetings in any way. And I don't think that with COVID, it's been something that's been allowed to, really be debated in the Foreign Affairs Committee. Should we have a strong and clear position? Absolutely, we should. Yes.
Great, thank you so much. So I think that's, we're doing one more question, and then I think we're going to ask for concluding statements, and I think we'll be done. So this one is from Tim Kennelly. What can we as Canadians do to demand that our government end its support for the coup government in Bolivia? And I'll maybe open this question up to all of our panelists, again, starting with Ollie, Guillaume, and Matthew. Ollie?
So yeah, I think, as I said in my introduction, I think it's important to call on the government, on the Canadian governments, on the UK governments, European governments, to condemn the use of paramilitaries, of right-wing, far-right paramilitaries, who are assaulting Indigenous people for protesting, for asking for their rights, for asking for the restoration of democracy. That's very important to sort of ostracize Bolivia for its use of right-wing paramilitaries. And the second point is to pressure the government as much as possible, to ask the Canadian government to pressure the Bolivian government as much as possible to hold free and fair elections as soon as possible. But I think beyond that, beyond sort of asking governments about statements, things like this, I think just by talking, as individuals, just by talking about Bolivia, not letting people forget about the tragedy that's taken place here, I think that's incredibly important. And I think it brings a lot of lessons for your own countries as well, for Canada and beyond, because I think Bolivia, a lot of people call it maybe a fascist government or a Christian fascist government. I think it certainly has those tendencies. But above all, it's a neoliberal government, a neoliberal system that preaches the values of, liberty, democracy. But at the moment, when market interests threatened, those get sort of tossed aside, and you get the killings, you get the massacres, until movements that are calling for national sovereignty, calling for the nationalization of natural resources, till those movements are crushed and can no longer come back to power. And if that can happen in Bolivia, it can happen anywhere. It happens regularly in Latin America. It can happen even, I think, in countries of the global north, in Canada, in the UK, in the US. I think in the UK we came very close to having Jeremy Corbyn elected as the Prime Minister of the country. And can you imagine the sorts of forces within the state apparatus and on the streets, can you imagine how they would have worked together to create a destabilization of the sort that we saw in Bolivia? I think it's important to talk about Bolivia because it talks about the character of neoliberalism itself. Thanks.
Is it my go? I mean, I agree with Oli in terms of what he said. Essentially, governments, including Canadian governments, should be calling for an end to human rights abuses. Bolivia, it's been, now we've had several documented massacres. They've been documented by Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and also by a number of human rights organizations. And obviously a call for free and fair elections, and making sure the elections that are hopefully going to be held in October are free and fair. And I think Canada should definitely, the Canadian government should definitely ask for that. And I would add a question that the Canadian representative at the OAS could ask the Secretary General of the OAS in one of the permanent council meetings of the OAS, and that would be what were the basis on which the OAS said there was a drastic and inexplicable change of trend in the voting in last year's election. And if the technical guys at the OAS can't answer that question, and they're unable to answer that question every time it's been posed, then the Canadian government should ask for an in-depth investigation of what happened, because it is that sentence followed by a number of lies that created one of the worst military coups in the hemisphere in contemporary history, and has generated one of the most authoritarian governments and responses in Latin America in the last few years. And all the member states of the OAS, if they don't ask those questions and if they don't ask for that investigation, are complicit in that coup, and are complicit in those human rights abuses, and are complicit in that destruction of democratic rule of law.
Guillaume, I think that you're much more optimistic than I am in our liberal government that they're going to actually take those steps. But I do believe in the power of mass movements represented in Bolivia, but also here in Canada, as we've seen most recently around Black Lives Matter. The types of paramilitary repression locally by our police on Black communities, on Indigenous communities. Right now, 45 minutes from my house in Six Nations, there is an OPP occupation of traditional territories there. So I don't have faith that our government will do that, but I do have faith in the Canadian public to put the type of anti-imperialist and anti-war pressures to bring to light the government's complicity and role in this brutal, coup that's happened there and around the world. Like, this isn't unique. Unfortunately, Bolivia and what's happening there is not unique to the types of roles that Canada has played around the world. And my hope is that the people that are present here online, the people who are watching on Facebook or on any of the other live streams, begin to organize locally in their constituencies, in their ridings, to put pressure on their MPs to let them know that Canadians and people living in Canada are thinking about more than just themselves during this COVID crisis, and that we do want to see the values that we profess, the branding exercise that is Canada, that is the corporate Canadian brand of being this, this broker of peace and democracy around the world, that we challenge that with the stark reality of the roles that we've played and in the complicit nature that we've played in these types of government overthrows.
Great. Thank you so much. That was great. As mentioned, that was our last question. We are running out of time. I would like to thank everyone for submitting your questions. They were some really great questions. I was reading them here as they were coming in. So apologies if I didn't get to your question. Now I'll open it up just one last time to our panelists to see if they have any closing statements. And we'll start again with Ollie.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to those who've organised this important event and to everyone who's tuned in. I think, as Matthew said, the mainstream media, particularly in the West, wants to try and brush this under the rug, wants to try and keep people in the dark about the abuses, the human rights abuses, the economic collapse that's taking place in Bolivia. Because as I said earlier, the crisis, the total crisis across all parts of society in Bolivia is reflective of how the US governs its backyard, is reflective of how neoliberalism works in Latin America and around the world. The fact that you can take a country that's the fastest growing economy in the entire region and within 9 months have the economy ruined, I think should be a lesson for everyone. Bolivia's economic crisis started long before COVID-19. The austerity policies introduced just after the coup, which meant that all of Evo Morales' big development projects that he had ready, big infrastructure transport projects in Cochabamba, the industrialization of lithium, the industrialization of urea and ammonia. These were set to change the situation, to bring Bolivia out of poverty, to turn Bolivia into a country that can industrialize within the country and export value-added products rather than a traditional colonial position of just exporting cheap raw materials. That has been destroyed within just 9 months, and all Bolivians are paying the price. So I think it's important to keep people aware of that. And as I said earlier, it stands as a lesson of of how neoliberalism functions, of how the free market functions, and how the free market certainly does not need democracy to function. On the contrary, it can, as soon as his interests are threatened, it automatically moves into a position in which, into an authoritarian position. I think it's very important to remember that, to talk about it, to share what's going on. We'll keep reporting on CEPR News in English. Despite the conditions, despite the threats we're facing, we've got to push on. Despite the very difficult economic situation that we're facing as a media outlet that the government is trying to close down, that they've threatened to close down, obviously that has economic consequences as well. And I think the more that we can all engage with CEPR News, we're the only sort of media outlet that's speaking to the international community. Remember, there's no commercial flights coming into Bolivia. Foreign journalists can't come in. You know, we're trying to do the best we can to try and paint a picture of what is really happening in Bolivia. So I hope everyone can continue to engage with that. And I know many people have been a real help in promoting our work and shining a light on what's happening in Bolivia. So thank you.
Yeah, so I think what's going on in Bolivia is very telling of what's going on in Latin America at large at the moment. We're going through a really dark phase of our history. You know, you're seeing lawfare, political persecution, judicial persecution in a number of Latin American countries, even if I think Bolivia is the most right now with the threat of violence and it's a non-elected government and, you know, all sorts of elements that make Bolivia particularly scandalous. But, you know, the upcoming elections for the left in a number of countries really like a non-level playing field, you know, with banned candidates. In my own country, they've banned the main opposition party that I'm a member of so that we can't run. You know, this is really, really hard times. We discussed the reasons why this is happening. I think it's geopolitical realignment. There's a sort of Cold War taking place in Latin America between the US and China, all sorts of elements that we can go to more depth into. But I think what is amazing is that the media in the United States, in Canada, in Western Europe, and so on, generally speaking, the sort of mainstream media in the world is not really covering this. You know, I think it's the worst phase of media coverage of Latin America I remember. I mean, you know, the media during the military dictatorships, I don't remember that because I was too young, but during military dictatorships, you did have some media coverage of some of the horrors that were happening and human rights abuses. And in the 1980s, as well in Central America, the media wasn't always progressive, but, you know, it was kind of, there was the Iran-Contra scandal, and, you know, the Americans weren't always portrayed as doing the best thing in Nicaragua and so on. It was always, and even in the 90s and later Colombia and human rights abuses, there was always at least a portion of the liberal media, what they call the liberal media in the Anglo-Saxon world, that was more critical of some of the right-wing governments and sometimes came up with real stories, real journalism, real research demonstrating human rights abuses. This is not happening right now. There's nothing, and the situation is far worse than it's been in a number of countries since the, you know, you have to go back even before the 60s and the 70s, because in a number of countries, even military rule in some countries in Latin America wasn't as repressive as the so-called democracies we have today in terms of human rights, but not just social and political rights, not just civil and political rights, but also social and economic rights. So human rights across the board. So I think it's really important for people here watching this and in Canada and elsewhere to really put the Latin American issue back on the forefront of foreign policy issues. Latin America is going through dark ages right now, and it's important to have that international solidarity, and which is why I really celebrate this event. It was great to be on with all of you, and thank you so much for giving Bolivia and Latin America this important space.
Excellent segue. I'll close by saying I think we should extend our solidarity even further. My fear is that post-COVID, they're going to use these templates of right-wing overthrows, of interference in democratic elections around the world to further, you know, usurp democracies and to further marginalize and repress socialist, anti-capitalist movements. So continue to organize in your communities. You know, connect with like-minded people who share your values and put pressure on locally to the best of your abilities. There is both extra parliamentary and work inside the House of Commons and in our parliament that can, you know, shift the public discourse on foreign policy. Right now, we've been completely tied up with trade with the United States, with issues that are happening in China, and quietly, our government is involved in heinous things around the world. So let's shine light on that. Let's connect with great independent journalists around the world and continue to share, boost and amplify progressive voices to hopefully, you know, achieve that aspirational goal of becoming a real honest arbitrator of peace. Thank you.
Once again, thank you so much to all of our panelists for joining us and taking the time to be with us on our very first panel. It was a great conversation and we do really appreciate your time. It's clear that the mainstream corporate media and right-wing Bolivian leaders are pushing a narrative that isn't necessarily based on fact or the best interests of the Bolivian people. And it's important that we have conversations like these with experts who can shine a light on what is actually happening and what is really happening in Bolivia and across Latin America. It's the goal of the Canadian Latin American Alliance to bring you closer to what is happening in Latin America and shine a light on those who are doing the hard work, bringing us real news and research. Once again, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Canadian Dimension, and I'll send it over to Bianca, who has a few final words of her own. And again, thank you so much for joining us and sticking along.
Thank you, Ornella. Thanks to our incredible guests. You are all so very courageous. That's clear. It's been a terrific and utterly inspiring panel. Thanks to Ornella and all the folks in the background that you can't see who've worked on this at the Canadian Latin American Alliance and Canadian Dimension for organizing as well. I want to remind everyone about our upcoming talk with Venezuelan Foreign Minister Jorge Ariaza on Canada's interference in Venezuela. That's on August 20th. You can find out more at foreignpolicy.ca/Venezuela. You can also go to foreignpolicy.ca to sign the fundamental reassessment demand that we have of Canada around our foreign policy. So remember to act, push your MPs, support Calsachuan News. Let's continue to challenge and change Canada's foreign policy together. Thank you. That's it, folks.